Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption's webinar on navigating the grey areas. My name is Dr Pota Forest-Lawrence, and I will be your facilitator for today's webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and in my case, it is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people who are attending today. Today's webinar will centre on 3 corruption prevention experts from the New South Wales ICAC unpacking 3 prickly scenarios that you may face in your day-to-day work. They will draw on their expertise to drill down on the issues and provide you with ways to navigate these grey areas. The panel will take questions from the audience at times during the session, as well as during the dedicated Q&A part of the webinar. Our report on Operation Landon has been released and can be found on our website. This was an investigation into the conduct of the then Chief Executive of School Infrastructure New South Wales and others. It exposed a wide compromise of the integrity of processes. Key controls in areas such as procurement, recruitment, budgeting and accounting, and contingent labour engagement and complaints management were undermined by some individuals named in the report. This resulted in a general undermining of the probity of operations. We have also recently released a short animated video titled Coerced, Compromised or Groomed: How Public Officials Can Be Drawn into Corrupt Conduct. This is available on our website. To get things started, I would like to introduce our panel of experts for today. Firstly, just here to my left, everybody, is Lewis Rangott. He started his corruption prevention career at the New South Wales ICAC in 2003 as a Senior Corruption Prevention Officer and Principal Officer. He then held senior corruption prevention roles in the public and private sectors before being appointed to the position of Executive Director, Corruption Prevention in May 2017. Lewis is also a certified fraud examiner. Next to Lewis, and in the middle of the panel over here, is Giselle Tocher, has 19 years experience as a corruption prevention manager at the ICAC. While at the Commission, she's been involved in investigations and corruption prevention projects dealing with procurement, contract management and planning. Giselle also specialises in local government matters. Giselle holds a Bachelor of Laws with Honours and a Bachelor of Arts with Honours from the University of Sydney. And just to the left of Giselle, at the end of the panel there, is Dr Benjamin Marx, who commenced in the Commission's Corruption Prevention Division in 2006. Since then, Ben has performed or managed corruption prevention analyses of dozens of Commission investigations and managed or led many Commission corruption prevention projects, including the Commission's recent work on corruption control maturity. He has also led or managed many analyses of Commission datasets, including analyses of complaint, survey and document data. Prior to working at the Commission, Ben completed a PhD in psychology at the University of Sydney that explored some of the cognitive and attitudinal elements of moral reasoning, having previously conducted research on relative risk judgments. Ben is also a certified fraud examiner. Shall we commence with the scenarios? I'm sure everyone online is very eager to hear what the panel has to say. So, Adam, let's kick off with scenario number 1, please.
Tim is the chair of a tender evaluation committee for a high-value procurement tender process for technical services required by his government organisation. Lately, some situations have arisen resulting in panel members disagreeing about how to proceed. Firstly, during the evaluation process, one of the internal tender panel members casually mentioned that they have already seen a draft deliverable from a shortlisted bidder, as it was shared at an industry forum a few weeks before. Secondly, the company has a strong track record and is well known to the organisation, having successfully delivered previous projects. The company is also the incumbent supplier. Okay,
let's kick it off. Giselle, first question goes to you. How would you advise Tim in this situation?
Thanks, Porter. That's an interesting question. I think the real issue here is, has a tenderer received an unfair advantage? Now, that may depend. Tim really needs to get to the bottom about what this draft deliverable was, how it was mentioned at the forum. If an offhand comment just happened to be made about an off-the-shelf product that could be useful for a government agency to use, that's really neither here nor there. But if we're talking about a tailored presentation, an opportunity to lobby outside the process, or a private briefing, then really that does not present a level playing field. So I think Tim should be undertaking a few more inquiries, getting a copy of the presentation, talking to the panel member about what actually happened, in line with a probity advisor if the panel has one. In terms of what to do about it, I think if the process has been compromised, probably the easiest step is to remove that panel member and get someone else. However, that's not always easily done, and there's other things that can be done as well, maybe slightly more messier, but for example, all tenderers could be given the opportunity to present on their product. Though if you go down that route, really you have to ensure consistency and fairness at all times. This person's also the incumbent. That's not necessarily their fault. An incumbent's an incumbent. However, again, I think the agency and the tender panel have to ensure a level playing field. So when you do have an incumbent, it's best to consider that upfront in your probity plan. Have you got an outcomes-based criteria? Again, that's a level playing field for everyone. Have the other tenderers had an opportunity to respond? That's fair. Will you have pre-tender briefings or site visits? Those types of things really ensure your level playing field. Sometimes too we see things like transitioning in costs are quite high, quite a large percent of the criteria. Again, that can really give an incumbent an advantage. So really Tim has to be mindful of all these issues, and fairness is paramount.
Okay, Ben, I'm just going what Giselle was talking about in terms of fairness. Is there anything you want to add to that from your own experiences?
Well, I think when looking at fairness, I think you have to do a couple of things. You first have to look across, okay, what is the situation for each of the potential bidders? What do they know? Do they have the information? Do they have time to analyse it? So one of the issues with incumbent suppliers sometimes is you give the same information to all these other bidders, but it takes them a lot longer to digest it than an incumbent would, which can actually give them an advantage. And I think the other thing also, though, is the person compromised. So while it often makes sense, if sometimes maybe possible, to give other people, other suppliers, the chance to make it their own presentation, if that person has had a chance to answer questions, like Giselle said, they can still be compromised. I guess it's important just to take a step back and say, what are the general principles in terms of probity? What are the general outcomes in terms of fairness, value for money, and so on that we're trying to achieve?
So there's a couple of other points just to raise here. So in the scenario that you saw on the screen and Adam read out, the panel members are meeting, and one of them has just casually mentioned this, and so that's a problem. The panel should have convened and already sort of agreed what a communications protocol should be. It looks like this has kind of come up accidentally, and so that's not the best way to be getting your red flags, by just casual conversations where they pop up. So normally at the start of these things there's an agreed communications protocol that says if anyone in the market wants to talk about the tender, this is the front door and you can't use the side door. And so as Giselle said, this might be completely innocent, it might not be a problem, but the fact that the information is coming to Tim's attention this way is a bit of a problem. And it also says there, this industry forum seems to have happened a few weeks ago, and so again, this is too late to be finding out this information potentially. And I think one of the things we see in a lot of tendering situations often is that the chair, in this case it's Tim, he or she might be fully seized of the issue. They're probably the contract owner or the budget owner. And the other tech members, they're kind of like they're making up the numbers or they're the passengers. And that's a weakness in the sort of system. We need those people to be doing their jobs fully, and that might come out a little bit as we discuss the scenario a bit more.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Lewis. And the panel, all three of you talked about incumbents. So speaking of incumbents, is it okay for the public official who manages the incumbent supplier to be on the tech? Ben or Giselle? Lewis?
Again, another good question. We actually get asked this quite a bit. One reason, I guess, for having them there is because they have very good knowledge of processes and that type of thing. It's not necessarily a conflict of interest either. If it's just a purely professional relationship, there's no element of the personal. However, you do have to be mindful, for example, of perceptions and maybe the potential for unconscious bias. If they're spending a lot of time together, for example, in the field, that could give rise to a perception of unconscious bias, again, not having a level playing field. So really, it just depends on the circumstances, I think, and that has to be managed with other things, like maybe that person is a very technical tender and that person is the only person in the agency with the knowledge to bring to the tender panel on those particular issues. Can they easily be replaced by someone else, for example? That has to be taken into account.
Just to follow up on what Giselle was saying, how about if the incumbent wants to use the contract manager who is actually on the tech as a referee? What are some probity issues around that, Ben?
Well, that's interesting because when you approach a referee, you usually want to know two things. You usually want them to be someone who actually knows the person's work, and in this case you'd say the contract manager would hopefully do that, but you'd want them to also be someone who can give an honest evaluation. And I'm kind of concerned that if you're working with a company for a long period of time, are you really in a position to give an honest evaluation? You know, you're either going to form positive or sometimes negative opinions of them. So it's just the question of, I think it's going to, at the very least, it's going to be an appearance issue. It's going to appear, how can you generally do it? If someone's prepared to approach you for a referee, they must think you have a somewhat a positive opinion of them. And that's going to look bad to other suppliers.
I think another reason we get referees is to just get another source of information about a tenderer. So that's missing if you use a panel member. Having said that, maybe that tenderer has only worked closely with that organisation. That's not their fault. So they shouldn't be disadvantaged by that. So I think it depends on the circumstances. I think the panel could maybe ask them to supply some additional referees if that's possible.
Okay,
Over to you, Lewis.
So this happens all the time, right? And so you can go to the tender and say, well, look, this is a bit weird because I'm on the tech and I can't be a referee. Do you reckon you could come up with someone else? And if they say, oh, no, not really, that is telling you something, right? So it's probably telling you they've got no other customers, or at least none that are prepared to be the referee. So you have to be a little bit careful about the way you weigh that. But in a typical procurement exercise, you're asking questions, and one of the criteria is about their capability or their experience. And your duty to also explore their capability outside of what they've done for you is one of the things that you can do to try and level up the playing field a little bit. The other thing just to point out, we often see, and this takes it out of a grey area into more of a corruption field, we'll often see situations where there is a highly improper relationship between the insider and the outsider, and that's often this person who winds up self-appointed as the head of the tech. And they're sitting there with their colleagues on the tech saying, let's give this contractor ABC Pty Limited, they're great, they're the incumbent, I've had a great experience with them. And that just rolls off the tongue and sounds very persuasive. And in some ways, the bigger danger is if you've only got this one person on the tech and it's just maybe it's just Tim or just one of the key players on the tech who can vouch for this incumbent, but the other two on the tech or other members of the tech can't. That gets back to them being these passengers that I mentioned before. So often the chair has all of this positional power and it's their budget, it's their contract. And the thing that we're quite nervous about sometimes is this idea that it's a 5-person tech is just a mirage. It's really a 1-person tech if you've got this alpha who's calling all the shots. And if they're the one who's vouching for the incumbent, that can really throw the whole point of a multi-person evaluation committee out.
All right, well, that leads me to another question. A panel member discloses to Tim that they worked with the brother of a tenderer in their previous job. How would the panel advise Tim in this situation briefly?
Again, another good grey area. This may or may not be a conflict of interest. So just bearing in mind the common law test for a conflict of interest is to examine the nature, intensity and duration of the relationship. So maybe they worked together a long time ago, they didn't socialise, but I think some further inquiries need to be made. Is the member of the tech still in contact, for example, with the tenderer's brother or the tenderer? So it depends on the circumstances. But one sort of handy little probity tip, I think, is for tenderers to always declare associations as well as conflicts of interest. So that way they don't have to assess whether something reaches the level of an actual conflict, but any relationships outside of that process should be declared as well. And then it's up to the panel and the chair and the probity advisor to assist in assessing those.
Thanks, Giselle. I think Tim is having a bit of a bad day, everybody. He now receives a call from a senior executive outside the panel who expresses concern about the potential for delays and asks why the incumbent hasn't been awarded the contract. What kind of advice would the panel give Tim in that situation? Not sure who wants to kick this one off. Ben?
I think there are genuine times when you need to make a rush procurement decision. There are genuine emergency procurement type situations. But I think you have to have a process around that. You have to have a sign-off. They've walked into this process saying, we are going to do a procurement process. We're going to have this process and this is how we're going to choose a supplier. To then have someone come in and informally say, hey, why haven't you awarded, is quite problematic. I think it's a different story if they went back and they had a resolution and the person signed their name that this is the way they're going to do it. But this is basically a form of indirect pressure on him to violate this sort of procurement process. And I think, in a sense, as difficult as it can be, he kind of has to stick to his guns here and just kind of say, look, if there is a genuine change in the procurement process, I need it approved. But for the moment, we're going to proceed with the procurement process as it is.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Lewis, I might point this question to you. Tim becomes aware that one of the bidders has raised concerns about unfair advantage, alleging that a rival bidder was provided with information in response to a query that would have assisted their bid. How would you briefly advise Tim in this situation?
So this might be nothing, but maybe Tim's the culprit, so you've got to be careful about what you say to Tim. So we've got some colleagues in the room from ICAC, and so we sort of field these types of complaints or queries for a living, and you get a sense of these over time. So often the first thing that occurs to you is, well, how would this rival bidder know this? So sometimes you get complaints where they're unhappy for some reason, but they sort of cloak it in something else. But this needs to be taken seriously. So there's probably a mechanism in the paperwork that talks about how to raise a complaint. It's quite possibly, at least the way you've asked the question, that Tim's responsible for dealing with the situation. You know, if you get back to this scenario where Tim is potentially the wrongdoer here, we've got a problem if Tim can just deal with this unilaterally, for instance, by writing it off. So the whole of the tech should see this. And if there's a complaint about the process, the information about the complaint or the concern would need to get outside the tech as well. So in the previous question you asked, there was this improper pressure coming from the senior manager, and Ben mentioned why that's a problem. Once the query is about the probity of the way the tech's done its work, they can't solve it by themselves. It's got to go up a level or out to the project sponsor or something like that. So this might be nothing. This might be just a bit of sour grapes, but someone needs to look into it and take it very seriously. It might be that it can be corrected. So it might be that a piece of information found its way out and be corrected with an addendum or a clarification or something like that. But maybe there is a problem. You know, maybe the fix is in here, and one particular tender really has been advantaged. I might just go back to your previous question, the one about the senior executive. We prepared these questions that we've obviously all seen before ahead of time, but if you do actually get a chance to read our Operation Land's-End report, there's a couple of examples in there that sort of resemble that question. It is tricky because everyone has a boss, right? And so even though this senior executive is not on the tech, and we can sort of waive the procurement policy and say, sorry, this is the tech's responsibility to assess this tender, not yours, depending on the type of positional power this executive has and the way they choose to wield it, they do have some influence over the situation. So it's not easy to just say to these people, just stick to the policy and ignore what this senior executive's saying. So the quick example we saw in the Landon report, and I'm just simplifying things here. Some people were assessing a tender or a quotation, and someone said, oh, well, the director's not going to like that form of words. You won't approve that form of words. And they almost sort of preempted his objection and changed it into a form of words that they knew that the senior exec would sign off on, instead of making him disagree with the tech. And it's tricky because everyone's got a boss and you want to make things efficient. And this is why this is a sort of a classic grey area. You've got some positional power, kind of half directing the tech, who have these separate responsibilities to act independently of this person who's their boss. So it gets very tricky.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Lewis. And again, it's an opportunity for everyone at home today, wherever you are across Australia or even over the Tasman, to have a look at our Operation Landon report. Now, briefly, I might just, if anyone else has any other any points I want to raise, just in terms of the first scenario here, Giselle, any other? I would say potentially some other controls the agency could potentially put in place, managing the risks.
I think a probity plan's really important, and to develop a good one first up before the tender panel starts meeting and evaluating tenders. We often see quite vague, positive probity plans at the ICAC, like, oh, everyone's going to declare their conflicts of interest and kind of statements like that, but really dwell down to what are the sticky probity problems that you envisage up front could occur. For example, do you think you're going to have an incumbent who's going to put in a bid? How are you going to ensure a level playing field? Make sure all tender panel members understand what a conflict of interest is. Again, that should be explained up front, especially if you have independents who aren't used to working in the public sector, and that should be revisited at every meeting. Record keeping is also very important in these situations, documenting all decisions, any potential deviation from the process that you've established is problematic as well, for legal reasons as well as probity reasons, so that's something also to be very mindful of.
Excellent.
Over to you, Ben.
Ben, any last thoughts on this particular scenario you'd like to add?
I think I want to build on Giselle's point and say procurement planning in general is very important. A lot of the time when we see corrupt conduct in either the supplier selection phase or the contract management phase, we trace the issues back to failures in the planning, in the budgeting and the organising. And I think it's not, obviously probity planning is very important, but I think more generally we see that. I also want to make one general comment that cuts across a couple of examples. Remember that a conflict of interest can also arise from enmity. If you have someone who's managing the incumbent and they hate them, that's arguably a conflict of interest. If that person may hate their brother may hate that company they worked for. So just be aware of that, because sometimes people say, well, I don't even like them. Well, it doesn't mean it's not potentially a conflict of interest.
That's a really good point. A lot of the time we may think of conflicts of interest just in terms of the positive. We also we need to think of it in terms of enmity as well. So that's a really good point. Thank you, Ben. And what a great discussion on some key probity issues related to tender evaluation committees, particularly dealing with an incumbent supplier, conflicts of interest, acting as a referee, and pressure surrounding the awarding of a contract, as well as dealing with tender queries. These are all important issues. Now, here are some relevant ICAC publications that deal with the probity issues related to scenario 1. There is one on dealing with incumbents in procurement. So please feel free to pull out your phone, scan the QR codes that are on your screen right now, and it will take you to the publications, just some light reading there. First one's on dealing with the incumbents. The second one is about managing conflicts of interest. And the third one there in red is probity in procurement. So I'll leave this up on your screen just for the next 10 seconds or so. Okay, we are now moving on to scenario number 2. So Adam, over to you.
A local council has sought probity advice from their governance manager, Miriam, regarding a proposal to reduce the costs of hosting its annual Community Volunteer Awards Night. The council is considering approaching a sporting club within the local government area to host the ceremonies on its behalf. Under the proposal, the sporting club would provide the venue and catering at no cost to the council.
Okay, now before we go over to the panel, I want to hear from the audience at home today. So, Adam read out the proposal. Get your phones ready, everybody. Scan that QR code that is right there on your screen, yes. And answer the question, would you go ahead with the proposal? You can either answer yes or no. So anyone that has a phone is here today, scan that QR code and answer that question. Oof, okay. We're seeing some movement there, everybody. Most people are saying no, the few saying yes, that's getting smaller and smaller. I know, it sounds like I'm doing the races here for a moment. All right, majority of people, 88%, 87. All right, let's give it about a minute, everybody. Get those phones out, scan that QR code. All right, we've got over 100 people so far that have registered their comments. Let's wait for another 15, 20 seconds or so. I would say 85% panel say no at this point, 86. I don't think we're seeing much movement there. It's kind of in the mid-80s at this stage. All right. Okay, so we'll get that going. Just put to that scenario, everybody, back on your screen. So far we've had close to 150 people putting their comments through, and the majority here, 86%, would not go ahead with the proposal. So, panel, let's start off with your view on this particular scenario. So, Ben, over to you. What should Miriam do first?
Well, the first thing to note is that this is an innovative proposal. And it's easy to say, it's an innovative proposal, we've got nothing to rely upon. But one of the first things you should do is, well, where does this fit in with our general policies and procedures? To what extent can they apply? And legal frameworks and so on. Now, your first thought might be, well, it's just a gift. We're asking the hotel to give us something. But they're probably getting something from it too, the sporting club. They're probably, for instance, people may hang around after the awards night and drink and eat food. So they're probably driving up business. It also may be good PR for them to be seen as supporting the council or supporting the awards night. So in a sense, they're getting something for it. So they're giving something to council for free, but getting something in return. This to me is starting to sound like a sponsorship arrangement. It could even arguably be a commercial arrangement, but I'd probably prefer to it as a sponsorship. So in this context, you start to say, well, hold on, what applies to sponsorship? You might say, well, one of the things that is, are we giving all other parties a reasonable option? Are there other clubs, other venues who may actually be willing to also do the same? Have I unfairly restricted competition? And have I considered the kind of probity issues that you typically have with these sorts of arrangements?
Okay, so Giselle, perhaps you can answer this question. What are the probity issues that do arise from this particular proposal?
I think there's a few potential issues, but just to touch on one, look, obviously councils have commercial relationships with entities within the local government area, and that's fine, but is there a potential for conflicting duties here for the council? So the types of things that could be relevant for conflicting duties are, does the club, for example, have a DA pending with council at the moment? That's particularly controversial. Could that raise issues of perceptions of favouritism, for example? How are the health inspectors going? Are they having particular issues with that club? If they've given council a benefit, would they feel obligated to maybe go a little bit easy on the club? Are the parking inspectors still going to feel comfortable going over to the club? That type of thing. So there could just be a potential for duties to be conflicting to a degree that's really too risky for the council. So I think council just needs to do an assessment, maybe log on to the DA portal and have a look at any pending applications, those types of things, a bit of due diligence, and perhaps consider and assess the riskiness of the proposal. I think too there could be some opportunities for maybe a little bit of due diligence on the club as well. What are the directors of the club up to? Is it run by an outlaw motorcycle gang, for example? Probably unlikely, but you never know. So you do need to be careful of reputational risk as a council as well. Over to Lewis now.
So the other little issue to think about is if you hit up this club for this essentially freebie, you're putting them in a pretty crappy situation as well, because they might find it very difficult to say no, especially if council sort of regulates them or there's the DA there. So it's potentially not ideal treatment of that club. But the other thing you need to consider is also that registered clubs in New South Wales aren't allowed to retain their profits. They have to spend them often on community activities. So it might be nothing sinister about this at all. It might be that they've already got a relationship with maybe this club, or there's other not-for-profits in the organisation. They're on the lookout for opportunities to sponsor these types of events. And as Ben touched on before, we've got a policy and procedure in place to have this squared away already. That takes a lot of the risk out of it. And if you look at it in another way again, you could look at this and say, well, hang on, isn't council just trying to save its own ratepayers a bit of money? So I suppose that's one different way of looking at it, which has got a slightly more sort of noble purpose. And often a councillor on one of these councils, often it's the mayor. The mayor is quite probably already the patron of this club. And again, there's nothing too sinister about this, but the mayor might think, oh, hang on, here's this great opportunity. I can do this community event with this club, which is part of the community, and I'm the leader of the community, and all of a sudden, you've hit up the club for this favour. And so sometimes these things sort of take off pretty quickly, and you don't have a person like Miriam giving advice. I suppose the good thing about all of this is someone's actually thought, hang on, let's go and ask Miriam what she thinks, and that solves sort of lots of the problems anyway. But it's one of the reasons we designed these to be a little bit grey. This might be fine. You never know.
It may be, and I think the example that you just provided is in terms of the mayor, we might see issues with conflicts of interest and so forth. And I think just for the benefit of the audience as well, we did talk about conflicts of interest and also in the previous scenario. Can everyone tell me the difference between a conflict of interest and a conflict of duties? Giselle can? Over to Giselle.
I guess a conflict of interest that isn't declared is often more sinister and related to corrupt conduct. Sometimes agencies can have conflicts of duties, so these are two public duties that may appear incompatible with each other. I guess the most common example would be a council undertaking entrepreneurial activities, but at the same time regulating those activities. So for a conflict of duties, normally you have a more structured approach to managing it. So classic examples would be things like a probity wall would be put in place between regulators and entrepreneurial staff. They used to be called Chinese walls, but they're now known as probity walls. So it's a more structural approach, but it still has a capacity to undermine council's reputation within the community. And just touching on a few more issues with this scenario, I guess another potential side issue is value for money. So just say council decides to purchase extra catering, it's now locked into using this provider. So there could be some potential value for money issues coming up there as well. And does the club align with council's values? So if they've got poker machines, for example, service of alcohol, will all members of the community feel comfortable going there, maybe walking past the pokies or the bar, that type of thing. So again, it's another thing to look at, and those types of issues are often found in sponsorship policies. So I think that's important, getting back to Ben's initial point about what is this? What is this proposal? Is it a type of sponsorship? Is there an existing framework we can use to assess the risks and follow a proper process?
And Ben, is there anything else you'd like to add to that, to what Giselle said?
Well, I actually think, just more generally, I think this is a case where, as Lewis said, there may be some circumstances where this is reasonable. It doesn't mean that the rest of the community knows that. And if it's assessed to be reasonable, doesn't mean people know that. And this is one case where I think transparency in decision-making and that kind of stuff is very important. If you walk into it with open eyes and you say, this is a sponsorship hotel, this is exactly what you're getting, this is what you're not getting, or sports club, there aren't any other competitors, you put that all down there and that's all clear, well, you need to be able to demonstrate that, but you also need to be able to communicate that to the community. I think this is the classic case where you can make a decision that is entirely reasonable, but still be punished because people don't understand it. So I think in addition to making sure you consider the right things and make a good decision, you also need to be able to demonstrate that. It's particularly important here.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And circling just back to our conflicts of duties, which thank you, Giselle, for running that definition. What does the Commission recommend when agencies and councils experience conflicts of duty? I'm not sure if that's something you want to touch on, Lewis, or someone else on the panel.
Well, I mean, Giselle's probably the expert, but I'll have a go at it. And so Giselle talked about these sort of ethics walls, but I think the problem with sometimes these ethics walls, you might say, we'll keep the regulatory work on one side of the wall and our commercial work or our sponsorship work on the other side, but eventually the thing gets to the GM or the council itself and they can't build a wall through their own mind. And so they have to balance both things. But as I said before, the fact that you've kind of realised that you've got the conflict of duties gets you out of quite a few problems. But as Ben touched on, you can't keep everyone happy. So if they go ahead and accept this proposal, it might be that a rival club or a rival venue is still upset despite all of that. And so that's just life in the big city when you become a public official or you sort of take on public life. The issue, interestingly, some of the conflict of duty arises even if this hadn't been a sponsorship arrangement, even if the club was charging its normal market prices for these services. And it's kind of a problem you have with local councils in particular where we're all working in the sort of same community together. So even if you're gone to market, for instance, and said, hey, we want to get some quotes from the open market about how we're going to run our awards night, and this club wins it fair and square, you can still have that same issue because on the one hand they're your supplier, on the other hand you're regulating them or you're dealing with their food issues or whatever it might be. So you don't get out of this life without confronting a few of these issues from time to time.
No, some really good points there raised by Lewis. So conflicts of duty is really, really important, and ensure that we have the appropriate walls or whatever other probity controls you have in place to address those. So to the panel, are there any other probity issues that Miriam should consider? I know value for money was touched on. We touched on a little bit on fairness, or anything else that perhaps the panel can talk about.
So this is a tangent, but this comes up a little bit and actually came up again in the Landon report that I mentioned before. So imagine a slightly different scenario where they have gone to market and the club offers to do it for free. They put in a really low price. They're doing it for free. We see this with a lot of procurement. Sometimes a supplier will come in and they'll kind of try and buy a job, and they might just want to get their foot in the door because they might think this council is a really good customer to have. And so there's kind of a good side and a bad side to that. So in one sense, it's good because you've got someone who really wants your business and they're giving you a rock bottom price, and provided you think the quality's okay, why wouldn't you just go with this really cheap price and save the ratepayers a whole bunch of money? And maybe the club's having a slow month and they just need to get the revenues in for that month, whatever. The slightly less noble angle on this is when someone comes in and buys a job, they just want to get a foot in the door, and essentially, sort of in some ways, it goes back to some other scenarios. Get a foot in the door, kind of become the incumbent, and start accruing those advantages of incumbency. So get a foot in the door, become the incumbent, and run their business that way. Now, there's nothing corrupt about that, but you want to have your antenna up as the buyer, that's a possibility. And the one we have seen a few times, and occasionally this does turn into corrupt conduct. Especially if you've got an improper relationship between an insider and outsider, you buy the job, put in a really cheap price, and then the corrupt variations and contract extensions start to flow after that. So it's a bit of a trick that sometimes we see in our procurement-related investigations. So that's a bit of a tangent, but it's probably worth bringing up because we see it quite a bit.
Okay, thanks for that, Lewis. So just going about those probity concerns, would they be different, as was just touched on, if the sporting club did approach council? Is there anything else that we want to add to that?
Just quickly to touching on Lewis's point before I answer that,
Yeah,
I think
thank you.
it's important for the council to manage the club's expectations as well. So, for example, how long is this deal going to last? Does it mean the club is too cosy with council? All other regulatory activities will continue. So if the club had actually approached council, I guess the probity problem of the club feeling obliged to say yes would be gone. However, there could be other issues. So why is the club doing this? Do people always give things away for free? I guess at the ICAC we see the worst of human behaviour, so we tend to be a little bit cynical at times. But I think if the club were to approach the council, really council needs to sit back and try and quantify what's the club getting out of this, and that can help assess the risks of the scenario and make a decision. But other issues such as, conflict of duties, etc., they would still be there.
Thanks, Giselle. Ben, you have something to add?
Going back to what I said at the start, if the club approaches them, that becomes an unsolicited proposal. And maybe there are certainly state government, there are various rules around it, and in some local councils there are. And in a sense that, brings in, like I said, a range of different issues in terms of, to what extent you can approach other people if there is genuine IP involved or not, and to what extent, you almost sometimes can become unnecessarily involved in direct negotiations. So I guess the thing is that, in a sense, means that this is why that first step of understanding where these innovative proposals fit is particularly important, because that can very much change the framework, the fact that the club approached them.
Yeah. Lewis, is there anything you want to add to that before we go to the audience for a follow-up poll?
No.
Okay, excellent, thank you. All right, so everybody get your phones out. We are revisiting that proposal. So please get your QR code scanner ready. The question is, would you now go ahead with that original proposal? So please scan that QR code that is on your screen. Ooh, okay, let's have a bit of a look-see. Fantastic, everybody. So again, perhaps it's about putting those right probity controls in place, which will allow this particular situation, this particular scenario, to be part of the advice that Miriam can provide. So we got 77% at this point. All right, we'll give it another 20 seconds to see whether or not this swings. And as I said, everybody, scenario number 2, when we first went out to the audience, we had 86% say no and 14% say yes, and now we've got 77 and 23. So it's some really great advice here provided by the panel. Okay, so just in terms of what people can do when they do face a situation. If you are a governance professional working in the local government sector, it's about putting those particular controls in place and giving the appropriate advice. We have an ICAC publication there on managing conflicts of duty in the New South Wales public sector. So please scan your QR code there and that will take you to the publication. All right. So, scenario number 3. Adam, can you take hold of that? Thank you.
Diego is a compliance manager for an agency that enforces water regulation. He's regarded as an expert in the area. Diego has undertaken research and written for prestigious publications as part of his previous role as an academic at a public university. He's often invited to speak at conferences. Diego receives an invitation to speak at a national water regulation conference that's been organised by another agency.
Okay, Lewis, let's kick this one off. How should Diego respond to the invitation?
So, Porter, there are 3 types of public servant in New South Wales. They're the type that have never heard of Public Service Commissioner Direction number 1 of 2022. The ones that have heard of them, and I'm the 3rd type that brings copies to my webinar appearances. So the answer lies in Public Service Commissioner Direction number 1 of 2022. This is the GIFS standard in New South Wales. It applies to the public service, but not local government or universities, but you'll get the gist of it. So they deal with it in this way. They basically say if you're going to an event, it doesn't get into the detail of whether you're a speaker at a conference, but it says if you're going to an event and it's a bona fide work-related event, they don't class it as a gift. And so our studio audience here is just comprised of our colleagues, which is fine, but if we invited people to this event and they're here in person and there's a bit of catering involved with this and attendees are satisfied it's a work-related event, not a gift. It doesn't get classed as a gift according to the direction. Now it goes on to say you still need to be careful about hospitality and you still need to be careful about making sure it's a bona fide work-related event. But in the scenario here, we've got Diego, he's a water expert, he's been invited to a water conference and it's run by another agency. It's not many problems arising so far, but I think you're going to probably just tweak the scenario a little bit.
Yeah, and I've got a few questions for the panel here. So Diego is told that he can attend the 2-day conference for free. Are there any probity issues to consider?
I can imagine a situation where they say, hey, Diego, can you come and speak at our conference? And by the way, you've got to pay to come. That doesn't happen. That's not a thing. So, of course, your speakers get complimentary attendance at the conference. That's just, everyone gets that, right? But you still need to satisfy yourself that it's work-related. So you can't say, hey, Diego, it's a work-related conference, but that's in inverted commas and it's golf. that's different. But if you're still satisfied that it's bona fide, of course the speakers get comped. Of course they do.
Okay, well, panel, what if the conference is at a 5-star hotel and the lunch is akin to fine dining at a fancy restaurant?
So I've never been to a 5-star hotel, so
Okay.
Giselle can answer this one.
Has anyone on the panel been to a 5-star?
It may be getting more now into the realm of a gift, the fine dining. I mean, depends what your view of fine dining actually is, but that's starting to get a little bit more into gifts territory, and I think then who's asking you to speak at the conference becomes a little bit more relevant. Why are they asking you, assessing those types of things, a little bit of due diligence. Just circling back though to some other issues, because Diego has worked somewhere before that's relevant to the conference, I think he needs to be extra careful about whose views he's representing at the conference, and again talk to his manager about that when he gets permission. So he's there representing the agency, not his own personal views that he may have developed through his own academic research. So I think that's probably another little issue to look at.
Okay, thanks, Giselle. And Ben, what if the presentation is not about the work that Diego's done at the agency, but rather about his university research when he was an academic?
Well, this in a way builds on Giselle's point, which is, well, when you are there, who are you representing? Now, that works in relation to both when you're presenting things. So if I'm offering an opinion, I could offer an opinion about moral reasoning. Am I offering it from my own experience as a researcher, or am I offering it from the Commission? The Commission may well disagree with what I think. But it also applies to situations like the lunch. Okay, if I'm coming in as an academic, maybe I'm entitled to accept that lunch, maybe not, I don't. But so in a sense, whenever you're appearing at an event, it needs to be clear what you're saying and who you're saying it on behalf of. Moreover, if I'm representing my previous history at an event, if Diego's doing this, well, who is he working for at that moment? Is he actually working for the agency, or is he working for his previous employer? In that case, is this a kind of secondary employment type situation? And it's not, I'm not saying you can't do it, but you need to walk into it, your eyes open, it needs to be made clear, and that kind of thing. And it's something I sometimes do when I get asked questions at conferences. Sometimes I say, if I know what the Commission's going to say, I say it, but sometimes I say words to the effect that, well, I'm not sure the official position of the Commission, but my personal opinion is blah. And I think that's actually a very good technique for that kind of scenario. It just needs to be clear. You're entitled to have different opinions. You're not entitled to misrepresent your employer's opinion.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for that. And do you want to add something to that, Lewis?
Well, this doesn't quite say it in your question, but what you can't do as a public official is go to an event and say, well, I'm not going in my capacity as a public official, I'm going in this other capacity, and therefore just give yourself permission to get out of complying with the gifts policy. So if Diego says, I'm not going in my capacity as this, I'm talking about my university research, it's too bad, he still needs to comply. It might be still fine for him to go, especially if he follows Ben's advice. So we did have an interesting case a little while ago called Operation Galley. We had some councillors who just got themselves over to a signing ceremony for a big building proposal in China. And I can't remember what their defence was, but it was outrageous behaviour. No one at the council even knew they were there. They didn't even condescend to say, hey, we're accepting this invitation to this overseas trip. And so it's a slightly different scenario, but you can't just take off your public servant hat and say, well, I'm going in a different capacity, so it's none of your business, I don't have to comply, which is not quite the question here, but it was worth mentioning because it was an issue in that Operation Galley.
All right, thanks, Lewis, for that. And to the panel again, what if the conference was not organised by another agency, but rather a private company well known for its work in the water industry? Would any of the considerations be different, and how? Giselle?
I think Diego just needs to be a little bit careful because he works for a regulator. So what is the reputation of this company? Is there a prosecution afoot? So if that were the case, I think, again, we may be getting into the realm of something maybe he should be more cautious about accepting. I think he also needs to be careful about confidential information when he's at the conference. So confidential information can be the hard facts, but it's also information about his agency's attitude towards prosecutions, things that may not be publicly known and aren't meant to be publicly known. So again, he just needs to be really mindful about confidential information and any potential risk associated with this conference organiser.
Ben, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Giselle that information is a really important point. It's very easy to let things slip without even realising it. Someone discusses something, oh yeah, that's a future priority we're looking at. We're thinking of looking at more work in this area and less work in that area. That can immediately tell someone where they're going to, might create more regulatory risk for you because they realise they can focus in particular areas. So I think the information is important. I also think, again, perceptions are critical here, okay? What's going to happen if another company sees this in the space, another water company? And then later on, the company that sponsored them is approved for something. Now, that approval may be completely legitimate, but the fact that Diego is accepting all this trip from them may actually make people think otherwise, which again is the worst combination when you do the right thing but still get blamed for doing the wrong thing.
Thank you, Ben. Lewis, any last points on that?
So I'll tell you how we do it at ICAC. So we get invited to do public speaking, and it's part of our job because we've got an education function that you're a key member of, Porter. So the way we do it is a private organisation invites us to do some speaking in front of an audience they put together. We will satisfy ourselves that that's the right audience for us. So we'll ask things like, are there going to be some New South Wales public servants there? Is it going to be worth our time? And, is it going to be a decent number of people that we're trying to convey an important message to? So that's how we satisfy ourselves that it's in the public interest to do that gig. But then we also do a little bit of due diligence on who it is. So, there's a lot of these private conference companies, and some of them put on excellent conferences that are really good. But we just do a little bit of DD on who they are and does it measure up to our what we're trying to do is under our act, and it's probably something that Diego could think here. So sure, it might be a private company, but if his job description says I need to improve the way that the water industry complies with our regulations, and going to this conference and speaking at it is going to help him do that, then it probably can satisfy the colleagues that that's the case. That's takes away a lot of the risk for him.
Okay, no, some really good points here from the panel. So let's just stay on this whole idea that it is actually a private company, okay? Diego is told that if he presents at this conference, he can bring 3 people to the conference free of charge. Now, does your advice change at all in this particular scenario with having 3 people come for free?
So probably what's happening here is just a really boring conference and not enough people have signed up to go.
Trying to prop up the numbers, is it?
Probably what's happening here, right? This is why we're doing this for free, this webinar today, right? And so this happens all the time. You're running your conference and you're panicking a bit because you haven't broken even yet, and you think, I need to get some more people there to make my conference better. That's probably what's happening here. But another way to look at it is, is this a way that we can get some extra regulators into the room with us? And it's almost like it turns it into a small L lobbying thing. Now, I doubt the conference organiser has dreamt up this 2-part play where they get Diego on the hook first, and then they send in the second hook and try and get these 3 colleagues. It's probably just want more people there. But the 3 people there, if they're getting comped and they're not speakers, that's a gift. Okay. That's kind of getting into a gift. At least it becomes greyer. You still need to satisfy yourself, is this a work-related purpose? Well, you've probably already aware of the conference, you probably already decided not to go. If you're only going because you've been comped, that's a question about, is this worth going to? It might be fine. You just need to sort of run those things through your head. Maybe the colleagues have got a different point of view.
Giselle, any thoughts?
I guess a relevant factor would be, are we still at the 5-star restaurant with the fine dining? Because if you're bringing your 3 mates, that really brings it more into the realm of a gift. However, I guess the agency needs to ask itself, is there a genuine business need in, if they are 3 other agency staff, in all of those people going to the conference? Is it a particular way to influence the industry, or could that business need be met another way that's more efficient? So I do think you need to quantify what the benefit is, ask yourself, does it align with a business strategy? Is there a genuine need? Could that be met another way, for example?
Ben, any thoughts on that?
Just building on what Giselle said, it's often, well, what's the public interest here? So if this is some big event where there's 4 conference streams going on and all 4 streams are interesting, there may actually be a public interest in having 3 other people attend. You still have to weigh that up against the other considerations that's there. If this is a tiny event and it's a specialised area and Diego's the only person in it, you'd have to say, well, what's the public value in bringing the other people? So in addition to the perception issues, in addition to everything else, it's, well, one thing to keep in your head is, well, what's the public value here? And yeah.
Thanks, Ben. And thinking about conferences, most of the time they are sponsored in some way. So how about if the conference sponsor in this situation is a company that's regulated by Diego's agency? What are some of the issues that might arise as a result of that? Someone else? Ben?
Well, I think it's a bit, in a way, it's similar to the potential situations with the sports club in the previous one. You know, well, are they expecting a special deal? Are people going to think they're going to have a special deal? Is the person who's doing the regulating going to be captured by them and that kind of thing? It's not necessarily a great look. That being said, we go to events sponsored by councils and agencies and that sort of thing, which arguably we're regulating in some capacity. But we kind of, you know, it's just a matter of keeping in line with what's the public interest, making sure expectations are clear and so on.
Giselle, any comments there?
I think it could be worth looking at the sponsorship and what that involves. So if they're sponsoring, again, I keep coming back to this lavish meal at the restaurant, and the agency is prosecuting that sponsor at the moment, that's not a good look. So just be wary of perceptions, a bit of due diligence on the sponsorship, what that involves. If it's just normal sponsorship and they're putting up a banner and that's typical of that industry, that's different to a particular arrangement that seems to be offering benefits and gifts.
So we sometimes get like a private sector calling us and they'll say, oh, I've been told by this agency I'm not allowed to be in the same room as a person who's a public official. And then they say it's because ICAC says so. And so you have to be very careful about a situation where you take probity so far that you couldn't possibly be in the same room as a person you regulate, or you couldn't possibly be in the same room as someone who's your supplier. That's just nonsense. So you still want Diego and the three colleagues who may or may not be going to behave themselves. But I think when you get to a situation where some probity person says you couldn't possibly be in the same room with this person because you're the regulator, that's treating the problem the wrong way. It's like you're saying, you're such a bad regulator, the whole system's going to fall apart just because you're in the same room. So I think you can still say to Diego, yep, of course, it's important to go to this conference because you want to convey some information about our agency and what we're trying to achieve, but you need to be aware that, we're prosecuting these guys and we're taking a look at these guys, and so he can go in with his sort of eyes wide open and deal with it that way instead of saying, oh, it's just too hard, let's not bother going. Okay,
no, thanks for that, Lewis. And another point is we get asked a lot of questions about secondary employment. So I'm going to pose a question in this particular scenario with Diego about secondary employment. So if Diego had permission for secondary employment, say as a guest lecturer, could he then potentially accept a fee if it's being offered? Giselle, what are your thoughts on that one?
I guess it depends on the permission. And if the agency has given him that permission, a requirement should be that he actually loops back each time that he's got an engagement where he's being paid for, and they can consider who is paying him, because I think that's an important part of any secondary employment approval.
Ben, any comments on that?
I think it's very important, if that is accepted, it becomes crystal clear, as we said before, who he's speaking for. That if he's being paid to go do this talk, then he's not working for the agency at that point in time, and that needs to be crystal clear if you're going to do that.
Okay. Any comments on that? Lewis, do you want to add to that? No? Okay. So generally, as we all know, many of us have been to conferences over the years, there is a trade exhibition attached to a conference. So in the situation here, let's say it's that kind of scenario. Some of the bags being handed out appear to contain items higher than your token value. What should Diego do in those situations?
So again, this is a webinar about grey areas. So on one hand, you can look at it and say, well, you've, perhaps not Diego, but other people who have paid to attend the conference, they've paid, and the show bags and the exhibit stuff, that's part of what you're paying for, and so it's not a gift. You can do it that way. It does get a bit tricky. Like we do this. We go to various conferences and we give out ICAC merch, which we try to keep to a very low value. But yeah, sometimes you see some pretty cool stuff. And you think, wow, that's an expensive thing in the show bag. So I suppose if one of the colleagues brought that back to me, I would say, well, you're there in your capacity as an ICAC officer, you don't get to keep this. I'd probably make them surrender it to ICAC. That's what I would probably do.
Okay.
Now, where ICAC were a bit different, that there is that argument that, you know, the conference fees pay for that, so that's why it's a bit grey.
Okay. Well, let's think about this trade exhibition space as well, just following on from what Lewis was saying. Let's say it contains a lucky door prize, everyone. And Diogo actually is the winner of this lucky door prize. The prize is free membership and an annual subscription to a prestigious water-related publication. How exciting that is for Diego, everybody. Should Diego accept? Who wants to take that question? Ben, I can see your eagerness.
I think, and this is building a bit on what Lewis said the previous question, I think sometimes there's a false dichotomy with gifts between accept for me or decline. And this kind of applies also in cases when it can be awkward socially to decline. And I think it might be that the Water Journal actually has value for the agency, in which case Diego can accept on behalf of the agency and say, okay, well, look, yes, on behalf of the agency, I'm accepting this. I'm not getting any personal value out of it and that kind of thing. And we sometimes get that when people kind of take gifts in awkward situations and then they can't, they know they shouldn't have taken it when, well, a different option is just to give it back to the agency because you're there as an agency person, assuming he is that, given the previous questions. So if he wins it, then, the accepts it on behalf of the agency.
Giselle, any comments on that, following on from Ben?
I guess I'm ever the cautious one, so I would have a look at who's sponsoring the Lucky Door Prize and, again, is it someone where there could be a perception if you accept it? But other than that, all things being equal, I think accepting on behalf of the agency, there's probably likely to be a public benefit in the journal, so it could be okay. But definitely I would not be keeping it personally if I was Diego.
Okay, and just a final question to the panel. The conference is held interstate. Diego intends to bring his partner along, extend his stay, and have a holiday. Panel, what are your thoughts about that situation? What should Diego do?
I know back in the day, a lot of agencies had policies on this type of thing. I don't know if they still exist, but I would be consulting the agency policy and being upfront with my manager about my intentions.
Ben, any comments, or Lewis on that one?
Yeah, I think it's something you have to look at and say, well, what's the cost to the agency? What's the value to the agency? Obviously, if you need to upgrade the room to bring the partner across, that's obviously completely unreasonable. But again, it's something where often agency rules and perceptions are probably the key thing here.
Any last minute comments before we go?
So effectively
to
what's happening is you're using taxpayer dollars to subsidise the holiday, right? So Diego isn't saying, okay, I'm going to tack a holiday into the end of this and I'll pay for the flights. It's like, I'll be there already and I'm going to tack on a holiday to this. So I don't know what the policy says, I don't know what any other guidance says. If it was me and I would say, well, I can't have the taxpayers subsidising my holiday. That's not right. And so, but I could imagine, like say it's in a nice spot, it just says interstate, so we need to find out which state, right, to see if it's worth having this holiday. But if it was me, I would say, and I really want to do it, I'd say to my boss, look, boss, I'm going to be here. I wouldn't mind tacking on an extra week at the end of it because we're in this nice spot. I don't want to be subsidised by taxpayers, and this is the bit I'm paying for. That's how I would do it. Whether Diego does that, we just don't know. But that seems one way to deal with it.
And that's about being transparent up front in those situations. So thank you, panel, very much for your comments on that scenario number 3. And again, audience, if you can please get your mobile phones, get your QR code scanner ready. Scan the QR code on your screen there to go to our publication on common forms of corrupt conduct. Excellent. I'll leave that on your screen just for another 10 seconds. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Now it is over to you, our online audience. And we are here to take questions from you. So Adam has been conscientiously monitoring the questions that are coming from our audience. And Adam, You have some questions here for our panel members.
Indeed, I do have a question to start with, and if other people would like to ask some more questions, now is the time to do it. Just use the Q&A function. Our organisation works across the state, including very remote areas. When creating panels of contractors, we're sometimes challenged by having very small, sort of mum and dad contractors apply to be placed on a panel, and they inevitably need extra assistance to get onto the panel when compared to larger companies that have more industry experience and so on. How do we show we're balancing impartiality while trying to improve the overall cost savings of having local remote contractors delivering works in those areas?
So I can take a bit of a run at that. So often, it's like recruitment. You know, you recruit someone who's really good at interviews and you miss out on the person who's actually the best person for the job. So if, in this scenario, you want to get the best suppliers, not the ones that are best at filling out the tender pack. And if they're very small mum and dad companies, that's the exact risk that the person who's asked the question has foreseen. So one way to get around that is to change the way you do the procurement. For instance, by having some product demonstrations or a site visit or something that lets that mum and dad business show you that they're a good business. And if they're no good, you should still cut them. And it will orient the evaluation away from who's the best at filling in the schedules of the tender pack towards actual evidence of whether they're any good. But maybe the colleagues can come up with a better example.
I think too it could be worthwhile to look at the agency's strategies and whole of government policies. So if we're talking about some type of social procurement here where there's a whole of government initiative to support small and medium enterprises or maybe First Nations business, that could be a factor that could come into play here. But I would definitely be segregating staff. So if anyone provided a bit of assistance in just showing how to fill out a form, those people shouldn't be the people who are involved in assessing and creating the panel. So I think a segregation of duties here, to use that term again, would be worthwhile.
Ben, any comments?
Yeah, I think the segregations is critical. I also think, in a way, you need to think about your procurement strategy here. If you really want to get these small suppliers in, then why do you have a procurement approach that favours the big suppliers and that kind of thing? So think about, okay, is it a case because these are regional areas, I need to have sub-panels for these regional areas because this is where I need the small suppliers? Is it a case I need, as Giselle said, to weight things according to local preference small, medium enterprise preference policies? You know, in a sense, it sounds to me like there's a potential misalignment between what the procurement outcome is trying to achieve and the actual procurement process.
Fantastic. I might have a question just about Operation Landon, if there's scope for us to have a bit of a discussion. So, panel, just a question about some of the key findings. Is there anything that kind of you would like to discuss today, just in terms of the key findings, going over to Ben, key findings coming out of Operation Landon? What are some of the lessons learned, and what kind of advice can we give to agencies and other public sector organisations?
Landon was interesting for a couple of reasons. One of the things was there wasn't direct financial benefit going back to the main person, Anthony Manning. Instead, it was a clear case of cronyism, where essentially he was appointing friends and associates into positions and they were probably getting more than they should have, at least in some cases. I think what's interesting, though, from a sort of systems perspective with Landon, is it was the case where the CEO of what I'll call a quasi-agency was essentially directing things. So it's very hard to just say, apply your processes and procedures when it's the CEO who's undermining them and encouraging other people to undermine them. So while we looked at this particular one at all the issues with processes in recruitment, contingent labour, procurement, finance and so on, I think in a way one of the more interesting questions was, how do you manage this kind of CEO? Which applies more generally to how do you manage very senior people. So we spent, one of the chapters we talked about was that they hadn't really set themselves up to properly do this. They'd set up, for instance, an advisory committee, but the advisory committee didn't actually have the power to oversight Manning or get information about it. They were basically, he kind of ran them to an extent, unintentionally, but that's the way it worked out in practice. Essentially, the information that would allow people to manage Manning, often didn't reach the key part of the main department. And when information did reach the secretaries and stuff, it was sometimes ignored. So one of the key sort of lessons, something a little bit different from this, is about, well, how can you manage the risks of very senior people engaging in corrupt conduct? Now, this is something that's relatively rare in ICAC's investigations, and when it does happen, it tends to be very serious because you're very senior, you have the ability to do so much. So it's one of those relatively low likely but high consequence types of risks, and it provides some useful guidance around that.
Okay. Anything you want to add there, Lewis?
Yeah, so one of the things that my colleague Carlo zeroed in on as part of her analysis is the report talks a little bit about this thing called a reverse brief, and it sort of touches a little bit on the first scenario. So a reverse brief is where you don't really know what you want to buy, so you go to your supplier and you say, you tell me what it is I need to buy, and you write out the specs, and then we'll work out who's going to provide that thing, and it's the person who wrote the brief. So it's kind of like writing your own homework, submitting your own homework, and kind of in Landon, we also kind of almost had a situation where people were marking their own homework. And so this idea that government organisations, especially for really technical things, they don't actually quite know what it is they want to buy, and so they need the private sector to come in and help them work out what that thing is. And that's okay, but if they're just recommending themselves, buy it from me, buy this thing from me, this is kind of what this reverse brief problem is, and that popped up in Landon, and it's not a million miles away from this incumbency thing that we were talking about earlier. Often the incumbent isn't just there providing you with goods and services, they're running parts of your agency. They're all the way in there, and so that different, I think a more dangerous species of incumbency is something that popped up at a significant degree in Landon.
You talked about this dangerous incumbency that came out as a result of Operation Landon. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Any comments you want to say about what were some of the, I guess, the red flags that were potentially evident during this investigation?
Well, there were definite issues with the way the financing was done. So, for instance, there was a lot of contingent labour in this investigation, and there's a specialised role, but contingent labour was definitely overused in some cases and used in cases when it shouldn't have been. The fact is, though, it has to be paid for. And when you've got lots of people being paid more than they should have, where's the money coming from? And there was definitely concerns about the budgeting in this case. So, for instance, at least one CFO raised issues with the Secretary about that. There appears to have been cases where funds for capital projects were used to pay operational roles. The red flags there. Obviously, there were cases when people were walked out the door under unusual circumstances, or they attempted to walk people out. And there were bits and pieces like that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that's kind of happened in this particular case was it was sort of there a little bit, but Manning certainly built it up, was you kind of had shadow functions being built up. So a shadow function is where you have the main function somewhere else in the department, council, whatever, but a sub-area essentially replicates the functions in theory so they can do things more efficiently for purpose and so on. So for instance here, there was kind of like a sort of HR function with inside schools infrastructure separate to the department. There was a procurement function, and in a way these people got embedded into that, which meant that really created a real danger there, because essentially the people who had to some extent cases been improperly appointed by Manning, all that kind of thing, or brought in, were now basically in a position to control things like complaints against them, further recruitment processes and so on. So it kind of basically meant over time the scenario inside schools infrastructure decayed more and more and more as more people were in there actively undermining the systems and processes to protect Manning and his cronies.
All right, thank you for some great comments there from the panel just in terms of Operation Landon. And as I put up earlier, we have our report on our website. Now, I think there are some more questions from our audience. Adam, do you have a question for the panel, please?
I do. I've got several questions now.
Excellent, fantastic.
One of the questions that I've received is the following. What's the best way to deal with fast tracking requests to pre-qualify suppliers on whole of government schemes? So I guess it's really around how we manage the risks associated with that.
Giselle, do you want to?
I would say the process is a process. I think due diligence is very important. So I wouldn't really be agreeing to a process that maybe drops off particular searches that need to be done. I think they're there for a reason. Really, why is someone asking to be fast-tracked? I mean, that's something to consider, but yeah, I think that's a difficult issue. But really, if checks are meant to be done, then they're meant to be done. And we have seen situations where people have been put under pressure. So people, for example, accounts payable staff have been put under pressure by a corrupt person to pay an invoice particularly quickly, and it's so those sorts of due diligence, the three-way match isn't done. So just I'd be very wary about any pressure to do something particularly quickly outside of a real emergency that we can all see.
Lewis?
So we've seen this involving corrupt conduct a few times. So you have a situation where you're starting off with someone who's conflicted to the eyeballs. They're trying to do a favour for a mate, or it's their company or their spouse's company that they're trying to get fast-tracked. And assuming that's all in the dark and you can't see it, what happens is they become the referee and they get them put onto a buy.nsw scheme. And some of these schemes are set up so that a bona fide business can get on pretty quickly and deliver some small services. But again, it's the thin end of the wedge sometimes. So you're not going to get on one of these contracts if you sell submarines, but if you're a consultant or doing minor capex, it's pretty easy to get onto the scheme. So I suppose the question for the viewers today is, yes, that is definitely involved corrupt conduct, because once you're on the scheme, you can point to the scheme and say, I want to give a contract, $50,000 purchase order to ABC PD Limited, and look, they're on the scheme, and it just happens. And so it's almost like you're surrendering your due diligence to the scheme, and even if you read the fine print, the people at Procurement New South Wales that run the scheme, they explain how to get onto the scheme. So you're kind of giving up too early on your due diligence. So just because they're on the scheme doesn't mean they're right for you, doesn't mean you still can't check into whether they're a proper company. Often they're pretty terrible little $2 companies that don't have any actual track record. So you still need to keep trying on the due diligence side.
Very important points there just in terms of due diligence. And Ben, before we quickly go to another audience question, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add a particularly serious case from an investigation we had, Operation Yarrow. So the corrupt company was appointed, and basically they said, okay, you're not on the ICT services scheme, but we want you to be on the ICT services scheme. And they said, yep, we'll go and do it. And they never actually verified that this company was quickly added to the scheme. And in fact, they never were added to the scheme. However, the letter of engagement was under the scheme. So because they were trying to sort of get these things through, they actually engaged a company under the scheme when they weren't part of the scheme, which, as you might imagine, probably raises a few legal questions. So if you ask fast tracking, in addition to making sure your due diligence is still good enough, you also need to actually make sure it actually happens.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for raising also Operation Yarrow, and that's also available on our website if you want to have a look at that report. Adam, do you have any other questions from the audience for our panel?
Yeah, I have a different one that I guess is related somewhat to the scenario to do with the use of the club, but is more aligned to charities. It's a sort of triple barrel question. And really what the questioner is asking here is, what are the key risks in relation to things like conflicts of interest and other integrity risks associated with making decisions about charities that might be supported by an organisation or staff within an organisation? Are there any comments in regards to that?
Giselle?
I guess the same conflict of interest rules would apply. So is there a private interest with, in terms of your association with the charity? You also piggyback off the private interests of those with whom you're close to. So does your sister run the charity or your brother? Some charities may have a not-for-profit status, obviously most of them do, but that means they can't issue dividends, but people who work for charities can still sometimes, occasionally be on quite high salaries. So that's another thing to consider. So I think the same conflict of interest rules would apply in terms of the charity. I think maybe the smaller the charity too, maybe conflicts of interest too become particularly important. Like if it's a very small village association, for example, of a particular area overseas, and you're from that village or your family are, that association could also lead to a conflict of interest situation.
I think there's an interesting issue with how closely is the charity aligned with your functions. So on the one hand, if you're sponsoring a charity that's not aligned with your functions, the question is that a great use of money? And that's one sort of probity issue. On the other hand, if you're sponsoring a charity that is sort of in the same area as you also run the risks of what if they say something different to you? Or what if you have to take action against them? So for instance, if you're in a child safety area and you sponsor someone in that space, well, what if they don't care for children? So I think it's one of those things where it's very hard to give a direct answer in that context. You really have to also consider what your functions are, what their functions are, in addition to the kind of points Giselle raised.
So I'll go let you in on a secret portal. Most corruption prevention work is like boring and easy, just like checking stuff. All the corruption prevention is like checking stuff. And so when you go do procurement and you get a purchase order and they provide the goods and the invoice comes in, you check. Mm-hmm. And with charitable stuff, you give them the novelty check and you do the social media post that says, yes, we've given this novelty check, isn't this amazing? And you don't check. Did they actually spend the money on whatever it was you agreed? Like sometimes they just stick it in their bank account, you just hope that you assume and hope they probably will spend it on a noble purpose. Who knows? Maybe it goes to buy a car for the CEO of the charity. You just don't know. And so I think this mindset of novelty check goes out and then no one actually follows up. That's a problem with charitable giving. And for small amounts, who cares, But for big amounts, you've got to check, right?
I guess the lesson here is about due diligence. So thank you, panel. And one last question from the audience. Anything there, Adam?
Yes, the last question I'll ask you today is relating to managing a situation where you have the project manager who's dealt with an incumbent supplier who's also sitting on the assessment tender evaluation committee and is sharing their opinions about the performance of the incumbent supplier and the impact that may have on the less technically expert people on the panel in terms of the potential to improperly influence those people.
I guess this comes back to Lewis's point about someone dominating the panel, which can be particularly problematic. I think we had a question a bit earlier about this. I think if the project manager is particularly close or has worked one-on-one in the field with that tenderer, is there an option, maybe because of perceptions of bias, to get someone else on the panel? Will that just lead for a cleaner process? If it's a very technical thing, it may be hard to swap them out. Can you get someone from another agency involved in that situation?
I think there's a more general point here, which in regard to managing project managers, which is how can you verify the information they're providing is accurate? So in this particular case, you may be saying, well, how can you verify that their technical judgment is reasonable? And that's an entirely reasonable question. But there are all sorts of other things. And one of the things we see a lot in our procurement investigations is that particular case where the project manager is passing information across and that for either poor systems, end-to-end control or whatever, everyone is forced to kind of accept it as the way it is. So I think in a sense, and I know this isn't easy in a technical space like ICT, but I think you need to find a way, well, what could I do to actually check that the information I'm getting is reasonable or not?
I think there's also some obligation on the chair to, in this situation, hopefully it's not the project manager, to make sure all the tender panel members understand their roles, their responsibility, to stop someone dominating the conversation and maybe providing information that's not even part of the selection criteria. And is everyone being treated fairly in this manner? If someone can just really take on almost like an advocacy lobbying role as a tender panel member, that's quite problematic and potentially unfair to other tenderers.
Any last comments before we close for today? Fantastic. Thank you, panel. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to answer all of the questions posed to us today. We'll have a look at these and respond to a cross-section which will be uploaded to our website. Remember, you can always reach out for corruption prevention advice. There's an email address there, advice@icac.nsw.gov.au. Please reach out to us if you want corruption prevention advice. You can also visit our website for a copy of today's recording, as well as access our publications and other resources. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panel for providing such a lively discussion on some prickly probity issues. Thank you very much.